United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States are creating a new trilateral defense partnership known as Aukus, with the aim of working hand in glove to preserve security and stability in the Indo-Pacific.
This initiative is about making sure that each of us has a modern capability, the most modern capabilities we need to maneuver and defend against rapidly evolving threats.
A new US, UK and Australia strategic alliance to counter China's rising military power is raising concerns that it could lead to nuclear proliferation and an arms race. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Diplomatic relations between the US and France hit an all-time low earlier this month, following the announcement of a strategic defense agreement known as Aukus between Australia, the UK and the US that provides for the sale of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. The agreement, which led the Australian government to scrap a $66 billion deal with France for the delivery of diesel-electric attack submarines, initiated in 2016, provoked a rift between the transatlantic allies. France, which took the unprecedented step of recalling its ambassador from Washington for consultations, accused the US of engaging in lies, duplicity, and backstabbing. AUKUS, largely seen as a strategic alliance to contain China's growing air and sea power, drew a sharp rebuke from Beijing, which characterized the agreement as a step towards a new Cold War, and criticized Washington's decision to export its weapons-grade naval nuclear technology to a non-nuclear weapon state as a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
I want to be exceedingly clear about this. We're not talking about nuclear-armed submarines. These are conventionally armed submarines that are powered by nuclear reactors. This technology is proven, it's safe. We'll all undertake this effort in a way that reflects the long-standing leadership in global non-proliferation and rigorous verification standards, in partnership and consultation with the International Atomic Energy Agency.
The transfer of highly enriched uranium at over 90% enrichment levels, foreseen in the AUKUS agreement, would be a first and raises serious concerns from a non-proliferation standpoint, not only in Beijing. So, is AUKUS opening a Pandora's box? Joining me now is Tariq Raouf, former head of Verification and Security Policy Coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency. Tariq Raouf, the announcement of the tripartite agreement under which Canberra would be supplied with US nuclear submarines, a technology previously shared only with the United Kingdom, another fellow nuclear weapon state, came as a great surprise to many, obviously. For the French, it was a shock. Not only was Australia cancelling a $66 billion contract for the delivery of 12 diesel-electric submarines, but it had no advance notice. President Macron even recalled his ambassadors from Washington and Canberra over this issue. But diplomatic fallout among allies and commercial aspects aside, why is the US move so surprising and consequential? Because after all, the submarines are nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed. What sets them apart from conventional diesel-electric submarines?
Right. So you're correct in saying that this came as a big surprise to everyone. It also shows that the Biden administration is continuing with the Trump administration's policy of confrontation with China, because the sole purpose of these nuclear-powered submarines with the Royal Australian Navy would be to operate in waters close to Chinese ports and to interfere with the operations of the Chinese Navy. So from that point of view, it is quite destabilizing for the region as a whole in Asia Pacific.
Destabilizing because basically these submarines are nuclear reactors fueled with weapons-grade uranium deployed in our seas. You have said that Biden's decision was an ill-advised decision to supply these nuclear-powered submarines and related technology, saying as well that it will drive a stake through the nuclear non-proliferation regime. But the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, surprisingly permits naval nuclear propulsion technology, even if monitoring the fuel on these submarines and ships I imagine it's very difficult, if at all possible. Has Biden opened a huge gap in the NPT, a Pandora's box that others will be able to escape from?
Yes, that is correct. In 1987, it was Canada, when I was still there, that wanted to buy 12 submarines. So I wrote this paper, Opening Pandora's Box, Proliferation of Nuclear Submarines and Nuclear Weapons. So in the verification agreement by the International Atomic Energy Agency under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it does have what is called a gray area, where a non-nuclear weapon country like Australia can exempt the nuclear fuel for a nuclear-powered ship or submarine, even if it is weapon-grade uranium. So this was a loophole that was built into the verification system because in the early 70s, nuclear propulsion was being considered by Germany. It had a nuclear cargo ship. Japan had a nuclear cargo ship. So they thought that this would be a viable source in the future to have nuclear-powered ships and submarines.
And so what happens now is very likely the Australian case will open a precedent. A number of countries will undoubtedly feel politically free to seek nuclear naval technologies. Brazil has been working on it for decades, but Japan, the two Koreas, Iran, and others could also seek nuclear-powered submarines, couldn't they? Theoretically, this could put weapons-grade uranium in the hands of non-nuclear weapon states legally.
Yes, Brazil for a long time has had a nuclear submarine development program using highly enriched uranium. We are not quite sure what level that would be. Iran has also justified having its uranium enrichment program as potentially fueling nuclear submarines. If Australia gets nuclear submarines, the US will come under a lot of pressure from South Korea, Japan, and perhaps even Taiwan to get the same technology. American submarines run on weapon-grade uranium, which is enriched to 97%. The reactor is fueled for life. It runs for about 33 years. The new submarine that the US is building that probably will be shared with Australia will run for 40 years. But for verification purposes, all the nuclear material, including its composition, the quantity, and enrichment level, will not be declared to the IAEA. So here we will...
How problematic is that? I mean, President Biden says, quote, "We'll all undertake this effort in a way that reflects the long-standing leadership in global non-proliferation and rigorous verification standards, and in partnership and consultation with the Atomic Energy Agency." Is this wishful thinking when uranium enriched at 90% plus can be kept outside of IAEA safeguards?
Well, I think President Biden put an end to US leadership in non-proliferation when the United States announced providing Australia with nuclear submarines. Because, as I mentioned, this opens this loophole. Other countries will want to do the same. And this will also not be good for Australia itself, because the IAEA will not be able to give Australia the conclusion that all nuclear material in that country remains in exclusively peaceful activities, which is what is required under the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Could this deal be derailed? Could it be scuppered because of all these issues?
I have a feeling that the Biden administration probably did not consult with the US Navy. Nuclear propulsion is the US Navy's most heavily guarded secret. It's the crown jewel of the US Navy. The US Navy is very proud that they have nearly 7,000 reactor years of nuclear-powered ships and submarines without an accident. Now, giving this technology to a country like Australia that has zero experience, it does not even have a nuclear power reactor, to operate a fleet of submarines carrying such reactors is opening the door both for possibilities of dangers for nuclear safety, nuclear security, and also setting a bad precedent for proliferation purposes.
And the US has gone down that path before. In fact, with your own country, Canada, in the late 70s, back then, the Director General of the IAEA, Sigvard Eklund, issued a letter to the US and to Canada advising that the deal might not allow them to fulfill their obligations under their safeguards agreements. So they had to abandon the agreement? Have the US, the UK, Australia overplayed their hand? Because it seems that there have been no consultations with the IAEA.
That is correct, although the three countries have jointly sent a letter to the IAEA on Monday of last week, saying that they will engage in negotiations with the IAEA on how to make this possible. In Canada, it was looking at nuclear submarines in 1987, but it canceled the program because Canada finally realized that they could not afford them. But in my study, I have a letter from the IAEA which acknowledges that the nuclear fuel for such submarines would be exempted from safeguards, and thus we would have a major loophole in the verification coverage.
How is the IAEA Board of Governors likely to react? It will be split, presumably. The annual General Conference of the IAEA concluded in Vienna last week. Do you foresee divisions?
Absolutely. So first of all, such a request has never been put before the IAEA Board of Governors. If Australia goes ahead, it will be interesting. Unfortunately, in the 35-member Board of Governors, the Western countries have about 20 votes. So if it comes to a vote, the US and its allies will be able to win the vote. But if the board is split 20 to 15 or 22 to 13 or something, it sets a very bad precedent. Because on these issues, the IAEA board needs to decide by consensus as in the past.
The implications of this agreement also would likely have an effect on the next NPT review conference, which is just this coming January. Do you believe the US miscalculated what this agreement would or could do to the non-proliferation regime?
That is a very good question. The next NPT review conference currently is scheduled for January in New York. I'm sure countries like Iran, Venezuela, some others who have political issues with the United States are under US sanctions, probably would not lose the opportunity to raise this issue at the NPT. And this might be one of those issues that could become divisive and therefore prevent a final agreement or a final document being agreed at the review conference.
And just how much would Aukus weaken the IAEA verification safeguards system, and how real would the possibility of diverting nuclear material for nuclear weapons be if this nuclear fuel is kept outside the scope of the IAEA?
Well, the possibility of Australia using this material to make nuclear weapons is very low. Obviously, the United States would not go that far to allow Australia to make nuclear weapons. But it would drive a truck, to use the expression, through the additional protocol of the IAEA, which is an additional element to provide a higher level of assurance that all nuclear material in the country is accounted for and remains in peaceful use, which would not be the case for Australia. Now, what the IAEA possibly might do is to say that all nuclear material in Australia, except for nuclear material in the nuclear submarines, about which we know nothing, the rest of the nuclear material is accounted for. But this again would be a very bad precedent, and it would weaken and gut the IAEA's strengthened verification system, in my view.
Let me ask you finally, there's a proliferation aspect to this, but there's also a safety aspect, isn't there? To state the obvious, nuclear-fueled submarines can suffer accidents and sink. In fact, several have sunk. The US have had 2 in the 60s that sunk. The Soviet Union and then Russia have also had several. They could even be targeted and destroyed in war, couldn't they? So we could have a nuclear reactor with 90% enriched uranium sitting at the bottom of the sea, leaching radiation for thousands of years, or even explode or melt down. Is that a possible scenario?
Well, if there is a radiation accident on board the submarine, that could obviously lead to pollution in the oceans. If the submarine is sunk in a war or as a result of a collision, if the reactor is damaged, again, there would be radiation leakage into the waters. China has already threatened Australia that if it gets the nuclear submarines, it will be added to the target list of Chinese nuclear weapons. And most importantly, the Australian Navy has zero experience operating nuclear-powered submarines. It's not the same It's a little bit like you and I were to get into an F1 race car on the racing circuit. So although we know how to drive a car, but that type of car is very powerful and needs a much different experience and expertise to operate it.
Certainly puts it in perspective. Tariq Raouf, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Today, only nuclear weapon states have nuclear-powered submarines: the US, China, Russia, France, the UK, and India. The US has only shared its nuclear naval propulsion technology once with the United Kingdom, a nuclear weapon state. So why has it now decided to share it with a non-nuclear weapon state, Australia? To discuss, I'm joined by Sean O'Keefe, former US Secretary of the Navy under President George H.W. Bush. Sean O'Keefe, you have been Secretary of the Navy, so you very well know that the so-called US nuclear navy has not been keen to transfer its nuclear naval propulsion reactor technology to other countries, even close allies. The Aukus agreement came out of nowhere, and I understand it was initiated last January. What prompted this unprecedented move?
My understanding is that it was primarily prompted by the Australian concern for the range and durability of the submarine platform they had chosen to be able to respond to the broader threat that's emerging in the Indo-Pacific that it was disconcerting to them. And so as a consequence, they viewed the limitations of the submarine capacity that they had and the conventional power capability as being inadequate to meet that full range and sustainability on station at distant locations. So as a consequence, this became an alternative they sought to explore.
President Biden says that AUKUS doesn't pose a non-proliferation risk. It is still unclear, though, if Australia will be able to meet all of these undertakings under its safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Is the US taking, in your opinion, a big risk by putting a lot of stress on the non-proliferation regime on the eve of the next NPT review conference, which is next January?
Time will tell. I think it's been very clear in the statement that over the course of the next 18 months, there will be an assessment derived and a full review on the industrial capability as well as all the matters pertaining to the regulatory activities of all the international engagement partners on this. So as a result, this is something that will play out. But nonetheless, I think the confidence is very high. That this will be a very, very manageable risk in the context that this is a partnership that has sustained over decades between all the respective partners, in this case of the UK, the United States, and the Australians, that has provided, I think, a very strong sense of assurance that this is really not going to be a matter. Again, over these courses, everybody's been clear that this in the next 18 months, all the industrial capacity and capabilities and so forth is going to be assessed in order to ascertain the very answer to your question.
But was there, do you think, a compelling reason why the United States would have decided to transfer this technology to Australia, a non-nuclear weapon state? Because the last time it did and transferred this technology to the UK, it was before the NPT came into force. Is there a scenario when international, even domestic pressure from Congress or US regulatory agencies would compel the US to revisit the deal? It had to do that in the case of Canada, I believe, in the 70s or 80s.
Again, I think there's a big difference between a nuclear-powered capability versus nuclear weapons. This is not a nuclear weapon. This is a capability to provide nuclear power that is not translated at sea or anywhere else into a offensive capability.
But it does involve highly enriched uranium, weapons-grade uranium, at above 90%.
No question, but so does a wide range of commercial nuclear reactors around the globe in lots of different places. So this is not a matter in which there's an easy conversion to something that becomes a weapons grade capability. This is something that is very much designed and has been operationally proven for decades as a very reliable power generation source to propel the submarine to the range as well as the on loiter time capability that has been demonstrated, proven, and has been a remarkably safe record over all those decades.
But can you imagine what would happen, or what would have happened, if, let's say, China had transferred this technology to Iran or North Korea? It would have been a whole different situation.
I have no reason to believe that they have this capability. So this is an entirely different kind of demonstrated capacity over all that time that no other nation state short of the UK has really demonstrated, as well as the French. I think the French have also, demonstrated the parameters of risk that can be confined, as well as the UK and the United States. But in this unique case, the US technology and the US capability incorporated in these submarine capabilities for nuclear power generation only has been superb.
Well, even if it is concluded, though, the agreement would mean that Australia is unlikely to see any of the nuclear-powered submarines before at least 10 years, if not much longer, which really begs the question whether this US initiative, because obviously it could only have happened as a US initiative, isn't just, and I'm tempted to say, isn't almost a PR stunt, because it's hard to imagine that half a dozen extra nuclear-powered submarines in the next decades or so would provide a strategic edge to the US, to Australia, in countering China's naval power projection.
I'm not sure I follow the logic there. I understand the point, and that certainly is a narrative that may be feasible, but it's certainly not one that applies here. This was generated exclusively by, again, the legitimate Australian concerns for its own self-defense capacity, to be able to provide the capability to have an extended range and a much more extended loiter time than only a nuclear power vessel can provide. And this is the best technology that is available. And I believe that those discussions, based on everything that's been reported, initiated from the Australians to the United States government. And they're a great partner, one that's been a longstanding, reliable friend in a wide range of circumstances. And we have a common interest in the Indo-Pacific to really respond to what has been an expanding threat that the Chinese have demonstrated.
But the US already has around China not just a fleet of nuclear-powered, but nuclear-armed strategic submarines. Doesn't this new agreement open a Pandora's box with Japan, the Republic of Korea, and others, feeling that they too can go down that route eventually?
I don't see the connection there. I think this is going to be a very unique set of circumstances, just given the extraordinary distance that the Australians need to operate, that is unique to any of the ASEAN nations that would be of interest in this circumstance. And they have a very strong, compelling reason for their own national defense to make that determination. And that was the request that they offered, I think, is a reliable, demonstrated reliable partner in which we've always had very strong relations with the Australians. This is just a natural extension of that.
All right, Sean O'Keefe, former Navy Secretary, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
The Aukus agreement came out of nowhere and astonished many, first and foremost France. The diplomatic and commercial fallout between Washington and Canberra with Paris will eventually subside, but the non-proliferation fallout of the agreement is yet to be assessed. It is probably too early to gauge what might be the implication of having, for the first time, a non-nuclear weapon state in possession of nuclear-fueled submarines, fueled with highly enriched weapons-grade uranium. It also remains to be seen how China will counter this agreement, which it has already condemned as a Cold War-era move. Clearly, the purpose of AUKUS is to contain China's power projection in the Indo-Pacific basin with a growing blue water navy. If the deal is implemented, it would only add a few nuclear-fueled submarines to Australia's submarine fleet, the first one expected to be delivered almost 2 decades from now. Meanwhile, Beijing will have had enough time and latitude to review its strategic posture in the South China Sea and beyond. So in short, it is unclear what AUKUS could bring on a military and strategic level for the United States or Australia, which has much to lose in terms of its relations, commercial above all, with China, which will undoubtedly have to counter the deployment of 8 Australian nuclear-powered submarines. But it is doubtful that it would constrain Beijing in any significant way. What is clear is that by forging ahead with this agreement, the United States, under President Biden, has decided to open a dangerous Pandora's box from which other nuclear-powered submarines could eventually escape. And that may prove a greater irritant or threat than the unstoppable emergence of China as a major superpower. That's all from me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the team here in Washington. Thanks for watching.